Morning, welcome to this plenary meeting of the London Assembly where we will be discussing fire and resilience in London. Are there any apologies for absence?
We have apologies, Chairman, from the Deputy Chair, Assembly Member Arnold, from Assembly Member O'Connell, Assembly Member Sahota, Assembly Member Curtin and Assembly Member Whittle.
Thank you very much. A couple of announcements. We've had a busy couple of weeks. The Housing Committee has published its Affordable Housing Register, a new annual report which clearly shows the Mayor's record in delivering affordable homes for the capital. The Transport Committee has published Broken Rails with recommendations on how rail services in London can be improved for passengers. The Environment Committee has responded to the government's consultation on banning single-use plastics such as stirrers and straws. We've also hosted the inaugural meeting of our youthful and energetic counterparts in the London Youth Assembly, and they have had a lively discussion about issues which matter to young Londoners. Declarations of interest. Can I ask members please to note the recommendation set out at item 2? Are there any members with other declarations to make which are relevant to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? No? Thanks very much. Could I ask you please to agree the minutes of the London Assembly Mayor's Question Time held on the 22nd of November to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. We now move to the principal business of the day, which is the question and answer session on fire and resilience. We have with us the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, Fiona Twycross, and Dany Cotton, Fire Commissioner. Morning to you both, ladies.
Morning.
Welcome to the meeting. There are 3 lead-off questions, and Assembly members may ask supplementary questions after each question has been answered. Before asking the lead-off questions, the Assembly will first receive a short opening statement from the Deputy Mayor and the Commissioner of up to 5 minutes in total. Fiona, do you want to go first?
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. I think that overall, I think it's fair to say that we've seen quite a lot of different ways of working since the governance changes took place earlier this year, both in terms of structures here, but also in terms of the ways of working we've got at the at Union Street in terms of my oversight and work with the Brigade. I think the Brigade has always had a reputation for transparency. I know this was an issue that members raised as a potential concern, and I hope if you have had concerns over that, you've already raised it with us, but happy to discuss that later. I feel that it's still maintaining those levels of transparency. I'm hugely proud to be able to work with the organisation. It's one of integrity, and I think that we do, however, still need to make sure we get the scrutiny right, and there's obviously always a balance to be done. So since my appointment as Deputy Mayor, I prioritise establishing effective new ways of working to ensure the Brigade is held to account with robust decision-making processes. As I'm sure the Commissioner will no doubt mention, the Grenfell inquiry has continued to dominate the work of the Brigade for the past few months. Phase 1 of the inquiry is now drawing to a close. It has heard incredibly powerful and moving testimony both from firefighters and residents affected by the Grenfell Tower fire. Having read many of the firefighters' witness statements, it's clear that they went above and beyond what could reasonably have been expected of them in a desperate attempt to save lives, from the Commissioner herself down to the first people on the scene. It is really important, however, that we do get answers for the residents, for the bereaved, in terms of making sure that we never see anything like this again. The new focus on resilience has changed my work substantially. For example, the London Resilience Forum was asked by both the Mayor and the Government to consider the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the capital. In October, the Resilience Forum published their initial report on Brexit contingency planning, and this identified priority areas for future work. Some of you attended, and thank you for that, the launch of London's participation in 100 Resilient Cities programme last week, which will see us developing an urban resilience strategy. Finally, before I hand over to the Commissioner, several members have mentioned to me how sorry you are to hear the news that Tom George, the Deputy Commissioner, intends to retire next November after 32 years' service. It's clearly some time until he leaves, but I felt it appropriate to put on record my thanks to him. He'll be a very hard act to follow, and for me, his departure is a reminder of the constant need for the Brigade to have strong succession planning in place. Thank you.
Very much. Commissioner.
Thank you. A great deal has happened since we came to plenary session in February. There have been some major changes and challenges, but many things we can be proud of too. As you're aware, the new governance arrangements came into effect in April, and they're very different to the previous system of governance and required a lot of reform both inside the Fire Brigade and in terms of our relationship with the Mayor, with yourselves as the Assembly, and how we work with the Fire Committee. In October, we issued our new modernised fire gear to all our firefighters and officers in the biggest kit update for 8 years. I know there were some raised eyebrows about the distinct gold colour, but it is designed to show up dirt and damage more easily than the old navy coloured gear. I'm pleased to say our fire dogs also have new tunics to match the crew, and you may have seen Sherlock stealing the show as always in the media coverage. Of course, we continue to support the public inquiry and the ongoing police investigation into the Grenfell Tower fire. Significant progress has been made on procuring the equipment, including the fire escape hoods, which were rolled out last month, and we're also trialling a new drone capability. Work to procure the new extended range aerial appliances is continuing, with the delivery of the first expected towards the end of next year. There have been small increases in the number of days we've lost due to sickness absence in the last 3 years, with the leading cause now for the first time being stress, anxiety and depression. We're putting new measures in place to support staff, and we've recruited 4 new counsellors who are in post. Our 2018 recruitment campaign attracted more than 6,000 applicants, including over 800 women who applied to join the Brigade. And a further recruitment campaign will be run in early 2019, which will continue to aim to increase the numbers of women and BAME candidates. I'm pleased to say we've had the initial findings back from the research we undertook to determine what barriers are stopping people from BAME communities applying to be a firefighter. We're starting to look into this fully, but the good news is that the barriers were things that were identifiable and things that we think are not insurmountable. A lot of it was about people not considering the career and thinking, it's not for me, without really understanding what the role of a modern-day firefighter entails and the opportunities it brings. The research showed that people thought positively about our service and that our biggest challenge is reaching out to people across London so they see it could be a career for them. To me, this highlights the importance of all of our outreach work and opening up fire stations to engage with all Londoners. We've had great success with the Total Recalls campaign to make white goods safer. At the last plenary session, the then Minister had just announced the creation of the Office of Product Safety and Standards, and the new Minister gave a progress update in August. I met with the Minister last month. She's given me assurances on how seriously she takes this issue and has agreed to us having regular meetings. The Fire Safe and Well pilot launched in 5 boroughs early this year, and over 700 people have been visited. Islington Seasonal Health Intervention Network, SHINE, have recently told us that we submitted the highest number of winter warmth, fuel poverty, energy efficient support referrals than anyone else in the borough. Looking ahead to next year, much of our work will of course continue to focus on the public inquiry and the police investigation. And alongside that, we will continue to work with building owners and local authorities across London to make sure the right measures are in place where unsafe cladding is on buildings. While London is unique in terms of its housing stock and the numbers of high-rise buildings, we will continue to support the National Fire Chiefs Council with fire safety work nationally and ensure that our smaller fire and rescue services continue to have access to our expertise, such as our professional fire engineers, that they wouldn't normally have. We will also grasp the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to improve building regulations and fire safety, and will continue to call for life-saving sprinklers, including retrofitting them in residential tower blocks.
Thank you very much. The first question is in the name of Assembly Member Dismore.
I think it's on the order paper, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, you know what the question is.
Do you want to do the question? It's on the future.
Who would you
priorities.
like to answer the question?
I think I'd like the Commissioner.
Yes. So looking at London Fire Brigade's future priorities. So I touched on some of these in my opening remarks, and I want to highlight that obviously one of the main priorities for next year will be continued support in the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the police investigation. We learn from every incident we attend, and immediately after the Grenfell Tower fire, I committed the resources so that we could learn everything possible from the fire and improve the safety of London in the future. My officers continue to work on the internal safety and learning review, and acting on that will be my top priority. As I said in my evidence to the inquiry, one example is the quality of the operational risk information recorded for Grenfell Tower, and at the time of the fire that fell below the standards expected of the Fire Brigade, and we have a project in place to improve this and upskill our fire station staff, not only with increased fire safety regulation knowledge, but they can use this so they can carry out fire safety checks while also carrying out other visits, such as our premises risk assessments and 72Ds and operational risk database visits. Not only will this aim to improve the quality of risk information we hold, but will in turn free up time of our fire safety regulation team. We'll also continue to roll out new equipment. So the example we've just recently had is the fire hoods, which offer the members of the public up to 15 minutes protection from toxic smoke while being rescued from buildings. We can offer people the hoods to be rescued, and it can be really beneficial, especially for people, maybe the elderly or people who are in wheelchairs. It might take longer to rescue. If the time duration of one hood elapses, we can then just replace them with another hood, so we can continue to protect the people, and they're carried on all our frontline appliances. Another one of the things we've started to see real benefits from is our drone trial, which has been taking place since September. We mobilise the drone team on every available opportunity. We have 2 different drones in place at the moment. Not only do they give the incident commander far better situational awareness of the incident, but they can be used across a wide-scale range of opportunities, not just fires. For instance, urban search and rescue situations, maybe collapsed buildings where we can get an overview, or where we have things like water rescue, where you can't have an immediate overview of it, and we can get the drones up, get them over the water, have a look. They've got a thermal imaging capability to be able to identify people in water, and we can also use the thermal imaging capability for fires. They were used very successfully recently to reduce risk and also to reduce congestion and problems with the local community when we thought there was a cylinder involved in a fire in a school that was under refurbishment. We'd had reports that the cylinder was on fire on top of the building, and we put the necessary exclusion zone in by launching the drone and being able to look at the aerial footage. We soon identified, in fact, it wasn't a cylinder, it was a water extinguisher of very similar shape and size, so we could reduce the restriction zone and put in more proactive firefighting measures. Not only does that enable us to fight fires earlier and to protect buildings, but it also means it minimises disruption from things like 200-metre exclusion zones had it been a cylinder on the roof. Also, another aspect we are dealing with, of course, is looking into the situation in control, specifically around training, around how we handle volume of calls in control when we have situations where we have large numbers of calls coming in. We've got a new training package that has been launched for our control staff, which we're going through at the moment. We're also trialling various different options to ensure that exchanging information not only between control and the fireground, but between our control room and other control rooms around the country, should there be the situation where controls are being taken by other rooms, so that we can ensure that information is being exchanged, and particularly in situations where we've got large numbers of fire survival guidance calls. A lot more of this evidence will be available in detail in the closing statement to phase 1 of the inquiry, which will be in the very early part of next week. Our thoughts, especially from the hundreds of staff who were part of the response on the night of the tower, will always remain with those who died and of their families and those people who lost their homes. I cannot stress enough my personal commitment and that of London Fire Brigade to continuous improvement and learning from major incidents such as the fire at Grenfell Tower. And of course, we will continue to work with building owners and local authorities across London to make sure the right interim measures are in place where cladding is on buildings to keep people safe. And as I said in February, what remains of crucial importance is we grasp this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to improve building regulation and fire safety. And my teams are working closely with Dame Judith Hackett on the fundamental changes to building regulation and especially improving skill in the sector. We continue to call for life-saving sprinklers, including retrofitting residential blocks. I'm pleased to say we have carried out a successful recruitment campaign this year, but we need to do more to reflect London's communities amongst my firefighters. And one of the things I think definitely helps with that is opening the big red doors of London fire stations up and inviting the community in. We had a very successful year last year, not only of open days, and I'm really pleased to report open days I attended, where we had outreach occasions occurring as well, where volunteer firefighters, members of our underrepresented groups were there actively talking to the community about being a firefighter, and we had a really positive uptake from local people wanting to be local firefighters. And also we're holding 18 community Christmas events this week and next week across London fire stations to bring in socially isolated and vulnerable people, inviting them into the fire station to eat with us so we can identify them, so we can help protect them and keep them safe. A lot of this work we're doing with our existing resources and teams. Others inevitably might bring new financial pressures. And even without these resourcing pressures, the Brigade incurs significant cost in maintaining its current capabilities. Our total spend on fleet is forecast to be £57 million over the next 4 years. We've got £14 million earmarked for a training centre and £5 million for the new Plumstead fire station development. Obviously, the Mayor's budget provides us an increase of £20 million funding for the Brigade over the next 4 years. In addition, we're using our budget flexibility reserve to manage those priorities with a total draw of £19.6 million by 2021. In the years after, there are more potential pressures, such as pension contributions, and these are subject to major uncertainties, and we have a government spending review next year as well. The short answer is we have the budget we need now for our priorities, but in the future we do have some gaps to make up with some questions about how we'll be able to do that.
Well, thanks for that comprehensive answer, Commissioner. The consequences of Grenfell led to your submission to the Mayor seeking additional £6.2 million capital and £5.8 million revenue funding, which the Mayor agreed to fund as the Conservative government refused to help. How much of that is featured in next year's budget and how much is being pushed forward to future years, as some of the equipment, for example, the extended duration BA and the taller turntable ladders will take some time to procure. The fire safety inspection officers need to be recruited and trained. Bearing in mind your extra funding bid was in the immediate aftermath of the fire, what additional funding demands has experience in your high-rise task force shown to be necessary since then, for example in greater numbers of inspections and fire safety visits, public reassurance, advice and guidance and operational training? I understand, for example, that the Grenfell Tower investigation and review team of 30 personnel is currently funded from reserves.
Yeah, and as you've given a very comprehensive list there, you know, there are a number of factors involved in the money we asked for. Obviously, a lot of the equipment is subject to procurement processes, and not just the procurement, but the actual development and building. For example, the extended height aerial ladders, you know, take a very long time to actually design and build. We're hoping to see the first one of those appear before the end of next year. What we've actually got now is the budget will reflect the actual pattern of our spending. Some of that will be subject to moving depending on things like procurement of items of equipment. The fire safety inspecting officers, as you made reference to, obviously we can't buy those off the shelf. I'm very pleased to say that we're introducing a new apprenticeship scheme for fire safety officers, which will allow us to make use of apprentices as well. And what we're also trying to do is look at how we work differently in fire safety amongst our teams, and recognising the work that we can devolve to fire stations to actually free up the subject matter experts to be doing the specific fire safety work. So I think that it will be a changing pattern. We have an amount of it set aside for next year. Some of it will roll forward into future years as and when we recognise the spending. I also think that unfortunately the cost of the Grenfell Tower, my own internal team, you know, that is a very big team, but it's a massive request. The amount of work we're already having to do for phase 2, the amount of information we're providing, the amount of, you know, Rule 9 statements that we're currently completing, and all that additional work does mean that not only is the team focusing on the internal inquiry itself, but servicing the needs of the investigation and, of course, the police inquiry.
Okay. The London plan, if approved in its present form, includes a number of fire safety requirements for the construction of new developments in light of Grenfell. This will create extra demands on the Brigade, for example, for fire safety inspections and advice. What extra resources will you need to cope with this, and from when will it be reflected in the budget? So
I'm really hoping that, as you know, we work with the London plan, that it shouldn't mean that we'll require extra fire safety resources, because we're sincerely hoping that, I mean, the new buildings in London are built to much higher standards of fire safety in the first place. So obviously the teams will be working at the initial stages, but we're hoping that the buildings themselves being safer, they will hopefully reduce the pressure on our fire safety team. One of the things that we are concerned about, of course, is competencies and skills levels of professional people involved, not only in the design and the development, but the build of those buildings to ensure that they are safe in the first place. And obviously we're working with the planning team on the implementation of the London plan and looking about how we can provide support to written guidance and programmes and sharing our own best practice.
And this year's budget submission to the Mayor, before any application of new savings proposals, indicate the various budget gaps leading up to £24.5 million in 22-23. The flexibility reserve enables the gap to be bridged for the next couple of years, but after that, from 2021 onwards, there's a significant and growing black hole. How do you see that being filled? That's probably a question for Fiona, actually.
Thank you. I think one of the problems we faced after the fire at Grenfell Tower was obviously that quite a lot of the big ticket items we thought we might be able to pilot in order to help meet the budget gap aren't really palatable anymore. So the day crewing in central London, for example, and the alternate crewing. So we're working on trying to identify different ways of meeting the budget gap, but actually it's proving quite challenging to work out how we can do that and maintain frontline services at the level they are. So obviously we're putting in submissions to the comprehensive spending review. The Mayor's done what he can in terms of increasing the council tax precept to support the work of the Brigade and support our future flexibility reserve. But at the moment, I think it's fair to say that we don't have a definitive answer about how we can meet that gap.
Thanks. And coming back to you, Commissioner, in light of Grenfell, how are you reviewing and amending command and control procedures to avoid confusion at major incidents, as well as addressing the IT inadequacies and failures on control units, which failures predated Grenfell, according to evidence to the inquiry?
Yeah, so obviously there are a number of strands of the work we're doing at the moment. One of those is reviewing our operational policy and procedures to ensure they're fit for purpose, to ensure they comply with national guidance, and obviously looking at how we match international operational guidance. Obviously we work very closely with the team. They're embedded in London Fire Brigade but do the national work. So part of that is about establishing those to begin with. Then there are a number of range of other opportunities. Some of those are about looking at our new command unit replacement project and ensuring that we have the right IT in place to provide the support on the fire ground. Part of that also is about the communications on the fire ground and the communications from the fire ground back into control. And that's obviously part of the programme of replacement breathing apparatus equipment at the moment, includes the communication interface. We're hoping to look towards new technology that will involve Bluetooth communication, which will involve much better for our firefighters. We're also making sure that, obviously the replacement of ESN and the airwave, we're keeping close monitoring on that to ensure that that will also assist, because it's all part of that package of command and control. And also we're undertaking a review of training, which will of course include incident command training for all of our officers from junior officer level up into including myself.
Well, thanks for that. That was the next point I was going to come on to about communication. What changes are you making to procedures for handling fire survival guidance calls and for better communication between control and fire ground commanders during major incidents?
So we're looking at various different options about the exchange protocol of information between fire survival guidance people and ourselves, and the fire survival guidance people in control and obviously onto the fire ground at the moment, and reviewing the fire survival guidance policy as part of that procedure as well, and I expect that changes will occur. We also want to look at having a scalable approach to managing fire survival guidance calls, whether it's 1, 2, 3 or 4, or the large, very large, unprecedented volumes we saw on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire. We want to also test through our own policies and procedures. We're doing some very realistic testing using our own control units, actually taking them down to Merton and having a testing situation with our control officers there, doing real life trialling of it. A lot of it is about making sure that we have the right training in place, not only for our control staff, but for our officers on the incident ground and those who are managing the command units.
Okay, and lastly, following on from that, in what circumstances and how would that stay put advice be changed? Who makes the decision and when, and how is that communicated to and by control into residents?
So obviously stay put advice is a building structure. It's predicated on the fact that buildings should maintain structural integrity for 60 minutes to allow us to go into the building and to extinguish a fire and people to remain safe in places that are not the original compartment of fire. Obviously there are situations that we know about where the buildings still have flammable cladding applied to them, where a temporary situation is in place where the stay put advice is no longer, we believe, fit for purpose. Those have already got underwrites on those buildings. We are aware of where those buildings are, and we are also working very closely with the owners of those buildings to ensure they have the right people in the situation, so they have wakeful watches and means of alerting residents in the event of a fire. Obviously any incident commander on the fire ground is within their own judgment call to make any risk assessment based to a fire they're attending and decide whether or not the situation they see in front of them is something that would require people to be able to leave the building. We're still faced with the problem that the majority of our residential properties inside London are single staircase, so should we wish to evacuate people from those buildings, there is still a risk if we try and evacuate people down a single staircase route that we are trying to come up through and we are trying to use for our firefighting equipment. So there are all those factors in place, the means of alerting people in the event of a fire in a building where there's no central means, there's no alarm, there's no current way of actually contacting all those people. All that will be subject, of course, to the ongoing review that we're taking part in But we are looking at all those factors now, and where we have the enhanced high-rise attendance that we've put in place now. So any building that we believe has cladding on it, we respond differently. We've enhanced our high-rise attendance. Any building where the callers state that there is fire on the outside of the building, we are now automatically dispatching 10 pumping appliances plus an aerial appliance plus the relevant officers to get the crews there very early stages should we need to evacuate.
Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to you both. My question is to the Commissioner. The London Fire Brigade has carried out over 1,100 audits of buildings with potentially flammable cladding since the Grenfell disaster. How are you coping with this workload?
Obviously, it has placed a significant pressure onto my fire safety team, and obviously we've had to reprioritise some of the visits we are doing away from some of the other visits that we would normally be doing as part of a structured plan, because the important thing is that we are carrying out the right risk visits to the highest risk people at the moment. We have a specific task force set up that are conducting those visits. We've got them in stages. We've had 3 different levels of visits so far to ensure that we are not only just visiting, but where we find the defects, we are going back and re-inspecting, giving people sufficient time, obviously, to put right what is wrong. But it is something that's placed significant pressure. We have recruited additional staff. We've managed to secure some staff who had left us to come back on sort of short-term contracts to assist, because part of our problem is about having the right levels of expertise and qualification in the people who are doing those inspections to ensure that when we're in those properties that we are able to make the sufficient judgments and to work with responsible people to ascertain what steps need to be put in place if there are defects in the building.
You mentioned recruiting additional staff. I believe you were recruiting to fill 27 fire inspection officer posts. Yes. What progress have you made in recruiting those?
So we've made significant progress, but the problem is the training. So obviously, you know, it takes several years to train someone to be a fire safety officer and a professional. So we have been lucky to secure the use of some staff who had previously left us. The problem comes, of course, that the public sector is not quite as attractive as the private sector financially for a lot of people. And the pressure on fire safety at the moment is huge because it's obviously, you know, very high on a lot of people's agendas. So I'm pleased we're having the introduction of a new apprenticeship scheme, which will bring people through as apprentices in the fire safety departments. And we've also recently recruited some new fire engineers into our team as well. And obviously they're the people who have the highest level of expertise and take the longest to train. And we've taken on, I think, 3 or 4 new engineers recently as well. So we're making steady progress. It is a work in progress and it will take longer, but we've been very clearly focusing on that and prioritising that.
Okay, thank you. And are you confident you have an accurate picture of the number of private residential tower blocks that have ACM flammable cladding?
We're as confident as we can be that the picture is clear and that where we know they are, we are getting out and inspecting them. Obviously, it has been a difficult journey getting towards understanding that picture because it hasn't been as easy to access information about private blocks as it has been about local authority premises and those that aren't privately owned. And it's been there has been the situation where it's been more difficult for establishing who is actually responsible for ensuring that the cladding is tested on those buildings. But we are building up, we think, a far more accurate picture now, and we are conducting visits to those where we know they are, and we are on track with visiting the properties that we know about and supplying the right information to the responsible people.
And what are the risks of EPS cladding, and what assessment has been made of the number of blocks that have that type of cladding?
So that is part of the ongoing assessment at the moment of different types of cladding, and obviously they will need to be subjected to the same level of rigorous testing that ACM cladding has been. ACM cladding is clearly the focus at the moment because it is the known risk and we have had the testing on it, but the EPS cladding will come on as part of the next set of testing. Obviously we are working with the National Fire Chiefs Council and we are working with all of the regulation authorities nationally, and we are taking a lead role in that because obviously it's so key because London has, you know, the most buildings that we need to cover. So we will continue to work with those to establish those risks, and where new risks appear we will be working closely with the testing regime to ensure that we are not only taking part in it but we're instrumental in leading the way.
Thank you very much.
Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioner and Deputy Mayor. Commissioner, you described effectiveness of sprinklers in residential buildings as a no-brainer. What progress has the London Fire Brigade made in promoting sprinklers and progressing the recommendations made in London Assembly's report on sprinklers published in March this year?
Obviously, as you're aware, I am a very big advocate of sprinklers, and I think that retrofitting of sprinklers into high-rise blocks is something that we really need to be pushing for. And I think that we have been very public in our support. We have been campaigning tirelessly to work for the fitting of sprinklers because we absolutely see the benefits of those, and we will continue to do so. We're hoping that the new approved document B, once the calls and the evidence have come through from that, will support us in that, and then it will give us further reason to be able to support that campaign. But it is something that we will continue to do, we will continue to work on, because London Fire Brigade truly see the benefits of sprinklers.
Thank you. Moving on to a couple of specific recommendations. This is to Deputy Mayor. Deputy Mayor, are you and LFB pressing the government as well as the Mayor to allocate funds towards London Sprinkler retrofitting fund for existing high-rise buildings, please?
I think we've got a piece of work to do in terms of convincing the government that sprinklers are necessary before we would even start expecting them to come up with the funding for this. I mean, we had a very constructive meeting, as you know, with Deputy Mayor James Murray and various people from the Mayor's office about this particular issue arising from your report. And I think that we need to have a concerted effort, a continued campaign. There's so many different groups involved in raising concerns and raising the case for sprinklers that it really is about time that we actually sort of got government convinced. And we know that it wasn't a recommendation within the Dame Judith Hackett review, but nonetheless, I think at every single point when we see the implementation, when we see the new building regulations coming through, we've got to actually continue to make the case for sprinklers. And I think once we've managed to do that, then we can make the case for funding. But at the moment, the government is not convinced of the case for sprinklers, and that's got to be the priority, because otherwise simply pressing for funding for something that they are not convinced of the arguments of is unlikely to get much ground. That's not to say we shouldn't press them for funding while pressing them on the arguments, but I think that we still have a hearts and mind campaign that we've got to do. I'm doing work with the Local Government Association, Fire Service Management Committee on this. Dany's obviously very outspoken on this, the National Fire Chiefs Council, the Assembly has been, LFIPA has been. There's so many people who are now saying that we need to move forward on this agenda. You've got examples from what's happened in other parts of the country, but I think that we've just got to press forward and at every single opportunity really make the case for sprinklers as a thing, as well as sort of making a case for the funding.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is that unless we really lobby very, very hard, both the government as well as in this building, the Mayor, the whole issue will be kicked in long grass, because every time we have major fires, recommendations are made for sprinklers, etc., and nothing at all happens. So this is something I'd like both the Fire Commissioner and yourself to support and make sure that something does happen and happen very, very quickly.
Yeah, I can absolutely assure you that both the Commissioner and myself are huge advocates for sprinklers and will carry on pushing with the support of the Assembly for this.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, you mentioned approved document B, I think it is. What conversations and pressures are you putting on the government to make installing sprinklers in all new buildings, residential developments above 18 meters in height mandatory, and are you pushing this to be included in Mayor's New London plan as well?
Yes, obviously we're using every opportunity to be able to push this agenda. We've given our response and we're working very closely with the approved document B. We also have, I'm very pleased to say, London Fire Brigade fire safety officers embedded in the team that's working with Dame Judith Hackett, and they're working on the recommendations from that as well. So we're using our, what we think is great, national influence as well to bring pressure and bring to bear, because as part of any safety package for buildings, we think that it's really important that we use our opportunities to be able to bring that pressure to bear and to be able to continue with our recommendations, which, as you know, is something we have been doing for a number of years.
Thank you. Moving on to another topic, and that's Hackett Review. What do you hope to see in the implementation plan for the Hackett's report recommendations when the government actually gets around to publishing it? Currently, the date published is 20th of December. We are not sure whether it's happening, but what do you think it should contain, or what do you expect it to contain?
So I sincerely hope that it will contain the fact that we need to have the right resources, and there needs to be funding available in order to ensure that the right building regulations are in place. I also hope that it talks a lot about the skills required and the competencies required of people who are involved in designing and planning, and all the responsible people who are involved in buildings, because I think at the moment that there is a gap there, and we hope that we will see detail of that come as part of that. As I said, we've been very lucky to work very closely with the team to be able to feed not only London's but the National Fire Chiefs Council recommendations in, and work very closely with Dame Judith Hackett. So we're very much looking forward to seeing the report published and hoping those things are there.
Thank you very much.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
My questions are about your future priorities and whether your budget will impact on your fire safety work, especially relating to tackling dangerous household electrical goods. I know the Fire Brigade, London Fire Brigade, has a really good record here, but obviously the challenges you're facing are soaring with internet sales particularly. I think I'd read in London every day a dangerous electrical good counts for one fire, which is a really significant figure. And we know from the Grenfell inquiry that it almost certainly started from a fridge freezer. Electrical Safety First highlights that the key problem is the very low return rate of recalled unsafe electrical goods. Do you agree with them, Commissioner? And how can consumer registration of products be increased in London?
Yeah, absolutely. The Total Recalls campaign that we've been running is something where we have been pushing very strongly for there to be a central point where consumers can check the safety of the goods they have in their house, because at the moment it's very difficult to understand whether or not the product you own is subject to any form of recall. So we want one central point where consumers can actually look at a product and understand it. Of course, one of the issues is around consumers registering their own products when they first buy them. Lots of people have anxieties about registering products because they think it is just a means for people to be captured as part of marketing and that they will just be contacted constantly. So people don't bother to do that. So we're also working on encouraging the public to actually register the products when they buy them, so that someone has the central register of who owns those products that are subject to recall. When I met with the Minister last month, I also expressed my concern about the sale of second-hand goods. Some of my fire investigation team have been doing some work with that. They've gone and randomly purchased some second-hand goods from shops, and of those sampled, several of those were a product subject to recall. Obviously, if you're a second-hand consumer, you have no idea of the history of the product. Not only that, I think part of the thing that really concerns me is quite often people who are buying them in second-hand goods shops are people who might be from more poor or deprived backgrounds. You know, people who haven't got the money to go and buy new products, and they're then putting themselves at a greater risk by buying a second-hand product that might be faulty. So that's something we especially want to focus on, is actually the people who are selling them, and the legislation that should be in place to ensure that they are selling products that are fit for purpose.
I mean, there is increasing an issue of second-hand unsafe electrical items being sold online, places like eBay and other websites. And at least if you go, I think, somewhere like the British Heart Foundation shops, they properly test everything before it's being sold on. So do you think these websites are far more than just a platform? And just as selling dangerous goods such as knives and so on, there's tight regulation. Do you think there needs to be regulation in this field online?
I think there has to be. I think that if you want to talk about the whole safety of electrical products and resale, then every single point at which a consumer might be able to purchase second-hand or brand new goods, all those people should be subject to the same legislation. That means that they have to ensure the goods that they are selling or being sold through their platform are fit for purpose and are not going to provide danger or risk to the people who are buying them.
And are you making the case in that particular, the internet sales, to the Minister?
I will be making the case. It is something that we have talked about. I said she has committed to regular meetings with me, which I'm very pleased about, and it is a subject that I will definitely ensure that I pursue.
Okay, and then I understand there's also a real issue, not just with second-hand electrical goods, but also sort of counterfeit electrical goods being sold online. Do you, in this area, also think there needs to be far clearer safeguards and enforcement advice for the likes of, I don't know, eBay, Amazon and other traders online in these sales?
I definitely agree with that. We've all seen the horror stories and pictures of especially things like fake mobile phone chargers, e-cigarette chargers, and those are consumer items that people regularly have in places like their bedrooms. You know, if you look at ones where, you know, we do a lot of work around not only the safety of the products you buy, but how you use them, you know, encouraging people not to charge their phones and put them under their pillows, that sort of thing, you know, that young people tend to, and all sorts of terrible things. So wherever we can, we are trying to make sure that fire safety messaging is coming across. But obviously the sale of fake goods or goods that are subject to not having the same rigorous testing is a huge issue, and we do have numbers of fires started by especially things like phone chargers, which you can buy very cheaply on a number of websites, or indeed, you know, in consumer places, markets, shops and things, and they are very high risk items because people use them all over their houses and in large quantities.
Yeah, and are you going to do some work on sort of consumer information to try to raise awareness about this hazard?
We've already done a number of campaigns. It's something we will continue to do, electrical safety. In fact, in the atrium of London Fire Brigade headquarters today is an electrical safety stand and a huge display about talking about safety in the home, and especially in relation to electrical products. It's something we will continue to campaign on because, especially coming up to Christmas, you know, you've got lots of people who are buying new products who are, you know, want to get a bargain, and we're talking to them about how you keep people safe in your home, you know, especially at this time of year, we don't want any tragedies.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Duval.
Yes. Can you just explain to us about some of the issues of risk of managing the capital projects? You've done a bit of reprofiling, it's been phased, and of course some are in your control and some are not in your control. I think it's important for the Assembly to understand how you're managing the risk about that, and what you're profiling, and when do you say, sorry, we've just got to go and do this?
Yeah, so obviously some of the issues around some of our capital programmes are subject to, especially our large-scale fleet replacement programme. So, for instance, the procurement of our turntable ladders, including the extended height, the product that is actually going to take potentially a year longer than we would have hoped. But as I say, that will, all those equipment, especially the vehicle ones, are subject to something that's a slow rollout phase. So it's not something where we get, you know, 120 new fire engines delivered. So sometimes it does take longer, the programme for that. A lot of the items that we have had slip are, some of them are to do with procurement phase, for instance, our fireboat retendering. So it's a very large project. Part of it is about making sure we get absolutely the right product for what we want to use it for, working with other partners as well to ensure that what we are buying is fit for purpose for collaboration work, for instance. Some of the issues around some of our huge projects, for instance, our new training centre. I'm actually very pleased to say that as part of the work we've been doing, we've been able to enhance the capability of our training centre whilst not increasing the price. That has taken a little longer in the design phase, but I'm going to very pleased to say the end product will be a state-of-the-art training centre for London firefighters in the south of London, which is something we've wanted for a very long time. So some of it is about us making sure that we have the right scrutiny and rigour in place to ensure that the projects are going ahead on time, and some of it is about making sure that we have got the right sort of tender in the first place, and we are making sure that we are looking at the market and that we are getting the very best product that we want that's up to date and state-of-the-art for London Fire Brigade.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Assembly Member Eshalomi.
Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. So we know that under the former mayor, 10 fire stations across London were closed, and they were supposed to generate savings of about 28 million. As of July 2016, 8 had been sold, but there are 2 still that are on the books, Clerkenwell and Southwark. Clerkenwell was due to generate at least 10 million, but this sale has been delayed again. So we see from the finance update in July that this has been delayed again. Do you feel that you've got an efficient and, you know, steady redevelopment programme in terms of making sure that these sales are proceeding as quickly as you'd want?
I feel internally we have a very good, efficient programme about how we manage the sales of our buildings. Unfortunately, the 2 places you mentioned, Southwark and Clerkenwell, have also been subject to external pressures. And that the inability for us to complete sales as quickly as we like is not within our control. We have been calling on the assistance of other members of our GLA family and the TfL to help us with that situation, but unfortunately the sales and the onward use of those buildings has been something that has been subject to external factors that we aren't able to influence.
Because on those external factors, on Clerkenwell to date, there's already been around 486,000 spent just on security costs. So in a sense, do you feel that there's a lot more that could be done to try and speed up some of that? We know that there are external factors, but there's additional costs that, you know, the Brigade's incurring on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's costing us a large amount of money in security, not only for Clerkenwell, but for Southwark as well. Obviously, it's not a cost we'd like to be paying for security. We would like to be able to complete the sale of those properties. We are doing everything within our power to do that, and we will continue to do so.
Deputy Mayor?
I think, unfortunately, it has taken longer to dispose of some of these properties than we might have liked. But I think that the example of the illegal rave at 8 Elburn Embankment shows that, unfortunately, we don't have any option but to have security on those premises while they remain empty. What I would say, though, is that you might have observed from some of the media coverage around Clerkenwell that we are trying to work with, where we are working with the council and with the GLA to try and find a way of the council would like to buy the property for affordable homes. So we're trying to move that forward. What I've learned is that actually you can ask questions about property disposals at every single meeting, which I do, but actually at the end of the day, all these processes take much longer in some cases where complexities arise. And in the case of Clerkenwell, I think it's fair to say that Islington Council successfully managed to block previous sales, which is one of the reasons that we've seen it both remain on the market longer than it might otherwise have done so, but also be in a position now where we can actually hopefully see that sold for homes for Londoners at a reasonable price.
And just on the sale of homes, obviously there are external factors which are beyond your control, but essentially do you feel that there's a lot more and lessons could be learned in terms of working with the developers or maybe the boroughs that purchase, so in Islington's case, or Southwark, where essentially the sale of Southwark fell through because the proposal then put forward didn't rightly, in my view, include enough affordable housing, and predictably the council rejected that plan. Is there anything that the Brigade probably learn, God forbid we find ourselves having to dispose any additional properties?
We will obviously we review and we plan the whole time. We work as close as we can with local authorities. We work as close as we can to try and update plans. And you know, it is a difficult situation where you're selling, especially such a large piece of property as Southwark is. Obviously, it's not just the site of the fire station; it's the site of the training centre, the museum, and the whole block. And it's a a very large piece of work to procure that. I'm very hopeful that by next week we will have seen some significant progress on it.
That's great.
I think we're expecting the transaction on Southwark to be completed by the end of March next year.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good news.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Desai.
Good morning, Commissioner. Commissioner, you touched on aspects of safety such as electrical, but I want to very specifically ask you about safety visits to high-risk people and places, which have declined by some 6,000 since December 2015. Are you satisfied that the Brigade is doing all it can to help vulnerable people, such as residents in care home, to stay safe?
Yes, I am. Although it may look like numbers are declining, what we have been doing is doing far more specific targeted visiting to identify at-risk people, not only just identified by their postcode, but what I have tasked is my local borough commanders, who are the ones who have the fire stations in the local area, to be specifically identifying at-risk people. So if they are in the a local vicinity and they see someone where they think they can identify something like hoarding or something like that, that they actually make that specific contact there. Where we're going into other houses to do visits, we're making sure that every contact counts. So we're making sure that where we're in a property, for instance, maybe fitting a smoke alarm, that we're then taking steps to identify things like trip hazards or electrical hazards. So it's about making every contact count, keeping people safe and well in their homes. But not only that, we have obviously been having a very high focus on high-rise premises since the Grenfell Tower fire, because very naturally people who live in those have been anxious and have required additional reassurance and additional visits, because we want to make sure that, you know, the offer to say that make sure everyone has a smoke alarm fitted and those things, where we have those priorities. So it is about measuring that risk against not just about numbers.
I mentioned care homes. So do you have any plans to help train care workers in fire prevention and to ensure that residential homes have escape plans?
Yes, we've already done some work for that. So in June, we wrote to over 2,000 care homes and providers to provide them with information and tools to be able to carry out person-centred fire risk assessments. That is along with information not only about things like emoluments, which are the fires we've seen an increasing number of. Obviously, they are very rarely the cause of the fire, but they can cause an increased fire loading or increased risk to people, especially if they are in clothing or bedding that's soaked in them. But also things like airflow mattresses and incontinence pads, where people are dependent on oxygen. So all those things mean that we are working very closely with care home providers to ensure they are doing those risk assessments on their most vulnerable people.
Thank you. Two more questions, again to you, Commissioner. So your Fire Safe and Well programme is being trialled in 5 boroughs. Do you have any plans to roll this out further? And if so, how could the Mayor help this happen?
Absolutely. The pilots in the 5 boroughs... Sorry,
and you maybe should come in as well, Deputy Mayor.
Did you?
Oh, was it to me? Sorry.
Well, no, to the Commissioner, but also if
yeah,
you
so we've got them 5
well.
boroughs, Greenwich, Merton, Islington, Waltham Forest and Ealing, and they've been very successful. We've completed over 700 visits so far, and our intention is to evaluate the programme before the pilot finishes and come up with some options to go determine the way forward. We welcome any support we can have from members of the Assembly about any additional help to enable us to roll that out. We think that it's a very important programme because it does give us the ability to target vulnerable people in their homes and to make sure that we are absolutely prioritising those and focusing on them.
Yeah, I'm conscious of my time. Deputy Mayor, have you got anything to add to that in terms of how the Mayor can help?
I think that this is a programme that we need to review when it can sort of completes the pilots next year. I think that the messages coming through some of these programmes at the Brigade are running, the Mayor can help by sort of, I mean, I think he's got 3 million Twitter followers, so it's always helpful to get the message out through that, for example. I think actually, I know that the Commissioner is hoping that the members here will feed into evaluation and sort of comment on the evaluation process. So I think hopefully we'll find a way of making sure members can do that.
And finally, very, very quickly, Commissioner, the Brigade's outreach work with young Londoners is quite rightly applauded, but you struggle to meet your target of reaching 100,000 young people a year. I've been to open days like at Dagenham Fire Station with fire cadets. And is there further support or joint work in the City Hall could do to improve access to the benefits of your youth schemes?
Absolutely. Some of that is about the numbers and the way we record them. We actually have contact with about 200,000 young people every year, but there's a number of different schemes that we don't record the figures, so I've asked them to have a look at the way we do that. But any opportunity that members can give to not only promote our youth schemes, but to encourage and help support, especially with funding. We're looking to increase the number of our fire cadets units that we have across London Fire Brigade, so we welcome any further support that members can give to help us do that, not only to promote them, but also to secure their ongoing funding. Would be very welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner. I wish you and your service well for 2019.
Thank you.
Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. My question is initially for the Deputy Mayor, but please, Commissioner, add to that. And it's about the London Resilience Forum. It exists to coordinate different organisations across London, but we know that austerity and government cuts have really impacted on those organisations. What has the impact of austerity had on your partner's ability to deliver what may be needed in the event of a major incident?
In terms of austerity, I think it's quite obvious that some of the councils are particularly stretched, and it will have an impact on their overall sort of internal resilience. But councils as first responders, which they are in the resilience sense, generally understand what their responsibilities are in that area. And through the Resilience Forum, we have a very well coordinated local authority panel. Every single borough has a responsibility to have a borough resilience forum. And actually, those are where we need to focus our work through the resilience group's work and through the London Resilience Forum to make sure that we're working with those groups to ensure that everything's working as it should do. because regardless of austerity, the partnership organisations are constantly evolving, the partnership itself is constantly evolving, and the ways of working always need to be able to respond to threats and hazards, as well as the events we saw in 2017, when London dealt successfully with a number of attacks and incidents, irrespective of austerity. So I think the bigger issue in terms of where the focus of the London Resilience Group's work is at the moment is actually sometimes where emergency planning and resilience sits within an organisation. For example, if you have a council, does it have one emergency planner working in a remote corridor who never gets to speak to senior members of staff, or is it an integrated approach within the council? Clearly more money would help people have stronger functions around resilience, but there are ways of ensuring that all organisations can contribute, and if it's a priority for organisations, you tend to see it delivered.
And can I ask, as chair of the Resilience Forum, are you able to, or does that forum enable you to check the robustness of your partner organisations and challenge them if need be?
I think it's each of the core partners has a role to assess their own robustness, and obviously some of them have got quite clear legal responsibilities as first category 1 responders or category 2 responders, and with a relatively small cohort of staff working in the London Resilience Group, they've each got their own specific roles in ensuring preparedness and resilience planning. They don't have an audit and inspection function that could do this. What they do is to work closely with partners to try and build up the sort of work on resilience, and make sure that the 200 organisations that come under the London Resilience Forum are working together and the collaboration is strong. Where they do identify gaps, they work to address this. For example, a couple of years ago it was identified that the faith sector panel, which is a very important panel for if you get a terror incident, for example, they identified that actually because it wasn't the core function of any of the individuals on that sector panel, that there was a need for secretariat support. And this now comes from the GLA under Debbie Weeks-Bernard's team. So it isn't to say that the organisations under the the London Resilience Group or the London Resilience Group could be strengthened at all. They have multi-agency debriefs after major incidents. They're trying to improve how lessons are learned and implemented both by the forum and around the work of individual sort of projects, and exercising can also help both in large scale and tabletop exercises, and when there's a debrief after exercises it helps people identify where weaknesses might be.
Thank you. My final question is to the Commissioner, and that's, we're aware that I think the majority of your operational staff...
It can be grey, but I think we went for well over 70, potentially 80 days without rain over the summer, and unless we get more rain over the coming weeks and months, we'll be back where we were earlier this year in terms of anticipating the likelihood of not necessarily just a hosepipe ban, but potentially more serious measures as a result of
which would
drought.
Be unbelievably disruptive.
Yeah.
And my issue, one of my issues about this is that obviously a lot of the work around resilience and emergency planning is done in partnership.
Mm-hmm.
One of the key partners here is Thames Water, and one of the things that they're seeking to rely on in terms of making sure that we're not short of water is that they're going to reduce leakage by 15% per annum according to their water resources management plan, and increasing that level. And yet the latest figures which have just come out show that leakage is up from 665 million litres per day to 683 million litres a day, and the number of pollution incidents is also up from 202 to 217. So and they also responded really badly in the spring when there was a series of burst pipes, and so we had many Londoners who were suffering from lack of water as a result of leakage on their pipes and bursts. So, you know, what more can we do to push Thames Water to improve their performance?
I think Ofwat has been pushing.
So this was reported in August, but according to the LFB papers at the end of June, the financial position was an underspend of £7.3 million, which is roughly 1.8% of your budget. Is that still the position, or has that moved between now and...
No, the underspend position has moved. Some of that has been around resourcing staffing due to an increase in the overtime budget, not only for frontline fire stations but for control. And that's something we're addressing at the moment by increasing the number of trainees on training courses and increasing the number of courses to ensure that we are at establishment anticipated by June, July next year. At the very latest, we've just moved another training course. That is obviously subject to fluctuations in levers, which we work on a prediction rate, but they are, you know, sometimes unpredictable. So that figure has gone down since it was last reported.
Because it's not a new position, is it?
No.
Underspends, particularly around staffing, is a historic problem for the LFB. It's got better, but it's not there yet. Are you, you said that by June, July next year, you think that that's going to be completely gone? Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, that's the plan. And that would only be subject to if there was, for some reason, a very large increase in levers. And there are, of course, always factors that might suddenly encourage people to think they might want to leave who are just on a week's notice, which are very difficult for us to predict.
I think we have figures. I had a conversation with Deputy Commissioner Tom George, I think it was either last week or the week before, and he went through the projections over the staffing figures and establishment, and I think we'd be happy to forward them to share with you, just so you can see why people feel that we will be on track.
Sure, I think that's fine. I mean, to be honest with you, as a heads up, you're going to get that question again next week. It might be useful to bring it with you, and then we'll go through it at that time.
Okay, no, we can do that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you, Chair. A quick couple of questions on cladding. Last week we had confirmation that the government is banning combustible cladding on buildings over 18 metres, which you all very much welcome. However, LFB in its consultation response said, and again we agree, that this was like treating the symptoms rather than the cure itself. So what steps need to be taken towards the cure itself?
So I think for me this is very much, you know, the cladding is just a symptom. It is not the be all and end all. And removing the cladding from outside the building does not in any way guarantee that the inside the building's fire safety compliance is guaranteed. And as we know from not only from fires we've had, but from inspections that we've been undertaking since Grenfell, that the number of buildings have very serious fire safety contraventions that do not relate to cladding or external fascia of the building. So for us, although removing of cladding is obviously a very positive step and is something that will make people safer in those buildings, it is for us as part of a whole package about fire safety. And that is not only about, right from the beginning, from the approved document B consultation, right from the initial consultation stages on buildings, but it's about the responsible people. It's about having the right people who are ensuring that checks and balances are in places, so that once those buildings are built, that changes aren't made that fundamentally affect the fire safety of the building and put the people inside at risk.
If I can come in on this, I think that one of the things we saw when we started having the inspections was pretty quickly it was quite clear that it wasn't just the cladding that was the issue in so many buildings. You think about the sort of evacuation of the Twycross estate, that was about a whole host of fire safety issues. And I think when the Brigade's position is clear that it isn't just cladding that's the issue, I think it's because there's a whole system problem. And clearly Hackett's review acknowledged that it was a whole system problem and that there were so many different aspects of fire safety that need addressing. And if you just focus on one aspect, so for example, it would be quite easy for the government to say, well, we've dealt with cladding now, we've banned it, then you actually don't get that opportunity to make the argument for some of the measures you'd like to see, like sprinklers. So we've got to have a whole system approach, a whole construction system approach, and also the lifetime of the building approach that Dame Judith Hackett recommended.
Thank you. For a minute, sticking to the cladding issue itself, is there a clear policy on what should happen to tall buildings that are already under construction, which may include combustible cladding?
So I think that you know, the recommendation about combustible cladding goes right across from buildings that are in construction to those that have got it in place at the moment. So, you know, we would expect that any combustible cladding is removed either as part of the removal programme that's going on now, if it's in a building that's in the phase of construction, it either preferably it's not put on there in the first place, or is removed or replaced. I mean, it's obviously, you know, the identification's been made, the ban's been made, and that needs to be acted on now to ensure the safety of the people in those buildings.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you. We now move to the question tabled by Assembly Member Russell, which relates to the workload of the Fire Brigade. Who do you want to answer it?
Do you want to answer that?
Oh, I was imagining Dany, but I'd be happy for an answer.
Shall I go first? Yeah. Yes, obviously, as has already been mentioned throughout this, and quite rightly so, the work we're doing around the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the police investigation will continue to be one of our absolute priorities and focus. It's caused an increased workload, as we would expect, obviously not only this year, but that for many years to come. I anticipate it will be impacting on the work of the London Fire Brigade, not only through the response that we're providing to the inquiry and investigation, but also through the fire safety work that we're undertaking. As discussed earlier, that's caused, we've had the high-rise task force that we've put in place, who've been reviewing all the risks associated with high-rise. We've conducted in excess of 15,000 activities for high-rise related work, including a lot about providing reassurance to residents, quite rightly so. People are very anxious. We've had coordinated visits with our fire safety teams and fire station-based staff, and completion of over 11,000 visits to high-rise buildings. Continuing to work with the government with building safety programmes and the key coordination role that I'm very proud that London Fire Brigade holds within the National Fire Chief Council to support fire and rescue services across the country. And this is about all of us being able to attract and retain suitably qualified people to be able to conduct those risk assessments and to work with fire safety departments. We're also obviously dealing with the issues we discussed earlier around new types of cladding, around the issue that came up recently around fire doors, and about how we work very closely to ensure that we are addressing all of those. One of the things we will continue to focus on, as I have pledged, is our work around recruitment. I was very pleased with the large number of applications we had in the spring, particularly women applicants. We've got 163 who've come through training school since we met in February, and 11 women currently ongoing training at the moment. As I said, we've undertaken the work now that we promised, which was around attracting black and minority ethnic firefighters. So our next campaign will be particularly focusing on that, because I obviously want to increase the representation of those people in the workforce. And following on very neatly from the conversation we've just had around drought, obviously one of the things that really impacted on us this summer was the incredibly hot summer and the very long and protracted grass fire incidents. Firefighters in London attended 1,969 grass fires this summer, which was an increase of 1,055 compared to the same period last year. Obviously, they are exceedingly hard work, they're very time-consuming and demanding, and the fire engines that attended these were occupied for 2,800 hours. Obviously, the work that we did in relation to that, calling for barbecue bans in public places, I wrote to all local authorities, asking them to support that. I was very pleased and heartened by the response of those local authorities, who were very keen to work closely with us to ensure the ban on barbecuing in public areas. It's very important to us that we can get the message to the public that we are not here to stop everyone having fun, but we can stop those risks from grass fires. We did a lot of work around campaigning around discarding of glass, around discarding of smoking materials, and all those things that we know cause accidental grass fires. Unfortunately, in that there was obviously an element, as there always is, of deliberately started grass fires and arson, and we did a lot of work around trying to target that as well. We have a arson task force that go out into local areas of risk. We have a task force that go out on bicycles to areas that can't be accessed by fire engines, to ensure we look at accumulations of rubbish, and we work really closely with local authorities to report those and get those cleared up where possible, so they don't attract either more fly tipping or arson as a result of it.
Thank you very much. And I want to pick up a bit more on the increased incidence of grass fires. The fact that this summer's heat wave, I think you said, meant that there were 1,055 more grass fires than previously, and I believe the fire that you fought on Wanstead Flats was actually the biggest grass fire. It took you days to put it out. Yeah. Now, what are the implications of this for the London Fire Brigade and for its operations next summer and in future years?
Obviously, if we see another summer like we had this year, then it is something we will anticipate will happen again. We have a lot of, I think people are always very surprised, and I have to say that my chief officer colleagues from around the country always tend to treat it with some amusement when I talk about grass fires in London, because people don't appreciate just how much green space we have in London and how vulnerable they are. It is something we will do further work, more proactive work next year with local authorities around how we can work in partnership to ensure that very early on that things like barbecue bans, safety in open spaces are widely publicised and we can work in partnership with. We want to make sure where we can have, you know, blue light collaboration on those, because for me it's no different to the risk when we go into somebody's house. So if we go into a vulnerable person's house and we identify there's a safeguarding issue or potential safety issue that could be burgled, we flag that and identify that and work with partners. I want to make sure that if our partners are in areas of open grassland, the police are out, for instance, Parks Police, that they can work with us to help us identify and prevent those fires in the future.
So that's a bit of resilience to get partnership working with the boroughs and with the police and other authorities. Now, you said if we get more summers like this, the Met Office published their UK climate projections for just in November, the end of November, and it showed that over these next decades we could see a 50% chance of each summer being as hot as the summer we had this year, and also the summer rainfall potentially reduced by a half, which kind of increases the risk because everything is very much drier. Now, we've just witnessed the devastating and previously unimaginable firestorms in California following on from a summer of terrible fires in Greece and even in Northern Europe. Places like Sweden and Norway experienced wildfires with very, very high temperatures and extreme cases of loss of life, and the whole town of Paradise in California burned down. Now, have you looked at the implications of this trend towards climate breakdown with drier, hotter summers for grass, park and forest fires? And in particular, have you considered whether there is a risk for buildings, homes and businesses in London?
Absolutely. And it's also part of the work the National Fire Chiefs Council are undertaking. We had a conversation at one of our recent meetings about wildfires and about the increasing prevalence. As you'll be aware, London Fire Brigade supported our colleagues in the north very heavily during their protracted fires they had on very large-scale areas across the moorlands up there. They obviously have deep, extensive peat fires as well, which is a very different situation to the fire we have, and they burn down, then burn along for days. So it's a large piece of national work that's going on, because obviously there are huge areas of the UK that are at risk. In London, one of the reasons we had so many resources at Wanstead Flats fire was because the fire was spreading so rapidly towards not only residential but commercial premises, including a petrol station, which is why we deployed such a large scale of resources to the incident to ensure we can protect those properties. It's obviously our key thing is protecting life, protecting property, and whilst we wish to extinguish grass fires, the focus will always be on the property that surrounds it. So it is work not only we're doing in London Fire Brigade. At the end of every large-scale operational incident, we have a performance review of command and of operations, where we learn lessons and where we can look and identify trends. We have a database for every operational incident where we record details, and where we can, anyone who attended the incident can record whether they think there was any changes that could be made for the future. We use that to do a trend analysis of our operational response, to not only look at the training we have, the performance of firefighters, but operational equipment and trends in fires. So that very quickly builds up a bank of evidence for us. So, for instance, one of the things we produced a number of years ago was something we call a water backpack, which is the equivalent of effectively a fire extinguisher on your back, so that you can go into areas, small grassland, it's got a small nozzle on it, and one person wears it and can travel out into areas away from a fire engine, not needing the use of a hose to extinguish fires very quickly. So where there is new technology that we can use to help to extinguish those fires, especially in remote areas, we will.
Thank you, that's very reassuring. The final question is, where do you see the greatest risks? In inner London, where you would experience the urban heat island effect, or in outer London, where there's more open green spaces?
I think both areas are equally at risk. We do have large pieces of open land inside central London itself. The parks, obviously, they are subject to anything else as dry conditions come along. Part of the work we want to do is ensuring that local authorities do things like maintaining the length of the properties they have. So cutting grass short earlier on will help us, because obviously the longer the grass is, if it then goes on to areas of sort of dense undergrowth, the fire will spread from that. So it's about focusing on the risk in those areas, and I think they provide an equal balance of risk for us.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time.
Assembly Member Dismore.
Commissioner, I just want to ask you a couple of questions about some of the recent written evidence to the Grenfell inquiry. Assistant Commissioner Mills talked about the impact on people taking off time with stress, which is something in fact you mentioned at the beginning. With the brigade being below establishment, how have we been able to maintain operational efficiency with so many people off? Has it been a lot more overtime? So that's one aspect. The other aspect I want to answer, and I hope this doesn't embarrass you, is some of the evidence from your firefighters. We've been very complimentary about your own role, both in terms of attendance at the incident itself, where one said it broke down the history of us and them culture between management and firefighters. And the other is the sort of step change in the way that the brigade has looked after its firefighters, for which they give you credit. So perhaps you could say, first of all, how you've been able to cope in the interim with the impact on operational efficiency, and on the other hand, what efforts you've been making to help firefighters who've had to take time off work get back onto duty as soon as they can.
Yeah, thank you. As you know, subject very dear to my heart. Maintaining the operational establishment has been challenging at times, and we have had to resort to using a large portion of overtime. Firefighters coming on off-duty days on overtime to ensure that we maintain our frontline capability. That's obviously not an ideal situation, but once we have the establishment back up to strength, that will help obviously mitigate that, because we have the system obviously on watches where it's not just, we don't just establish to the number of people you need, we're established to allow for training, for sickness absence and for leave. So once the establishment's back in place by June next year, then that will assist with that. The sickness and absence increase is something that, although it is an increase in absence, in some ways I'm glad that people are feeling able to be able to talk about the fact that they are having issues, the fact, and actually recording it as due to depression or stress or anxiety, something that necessarily wouldn't have happened in the past. A lot of people would disguise it as something else or just try to carry on when they really weren't very well. You know, it has been a terribly difficult and terribly challenging period. I think the fact that people are being able to be more honest and more open about issues around mental health is encouraging for me. I think that we know we have some terrible examples where people, you know, have felt so overwhelmed by situations, and I just want to make sure that we're doing all we can and putting every step in place. So we maintain regular contact with people who are off on long-term sick to ensure that we're doing everything we can to support them. We provide them with the opportunity not only to access our own in-house counselling team, they have access to our occupational health, but we also encourage them to visit the Firefighters Charity where they can have dedicated week-long sessions to help with rehabilitation and then coming back to work. One of the things we're working on very strongly at the moment, of course, is trying to prevent people having to take sickness absence by doing far more proactive work with everyone, all our staff, about health and well-being. And that's across a range of different opportunities. So we're encouraging a lot of people to be Mind Blue Light champions. In fact, we've just published recently, they've got a Mind Blue Light online survey at the moment about mental health and well-being that we're actively encouraging everyone to take part in. We have the increase in our establishment of in-house counselling teams. We've also working closely with our new head of HR about different strategies for our well-being, not only physical but mental well-being as well on watches. So it's about a range of different opportunities to allow people to stay safe, to maintain health inside the workplace. But then unfortunately, if they do have to take absence, it's about how we absolutely support them in being able to come back to work. And then when they come back to work, one of the things that we have had issues in the past is the stigma people have felt that if you come back to work having had a period of absence through some sort of stress or anxiety or mental health problem, that people have felt unable to come back and talk about it. We're trying to break down those barriers so that coming back to work from having a period of depression is no different to coming back to work from breaking your leg. People will talk openly and ask you how you are, support and encourage you, and that's the future I want to see. And I was very heartened to read some of the statements the firefighters put about the positive encouragement they've taken. And sometimes the journey's not been easy for me in being quite so open about some of the things, but I have felt the importance in talking about the fact that we all need to develop our own personal resilience, and that, you know, we're not robots and we're not all superheroes all of the time.
Well, thanks for that answer. I mean, I think people forget how or don't know how debilitating some of these conditions can be. The sickness levels in the brigade have been under scrutiny for certainly for as long as I've been around on LFEPA and now. Will you be trying to show separately the impact of Grenfell in those statistics so that people can actually get a true picture of what's been going on?
It's quite difficult in some cases to be able to attribute things. There are obviously some very clear cases that we can attribute directly to Grenfell. Some of the cases, however, it's an accumulation of events, not only obviously work-related, but people's own personal life events that have caused it. So whilst Grenfell might be a contributory factor, it might not be the most significant one. But I have asked my HR team to keep a very close monitoring on the cases we do know are related to Grenfell. And the other thing I would say is that this isn't the end of that. You know, the cases haven't stopped now. We're finding that people who have been up and given evidence at the inquiry, some of those have subsequently felt unable to come into work because of the additional pressure that they felt as part of that. We also know that some people manage to bottle things up and contain them for a long time, and then it might take 2 or 3 years before any symptoms come to light. So I've been very clear with people that this could be a developing picture, but it is something that we are constantly monitoring, and we are trying to put the interventions into place. But where we have direct statistics, we can supply those to you if you'd like them.
Thank you very much. The next table question is from Assembly Member Hall and relates to changing governance.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd appreciate both of your views on this.
Okay. Yep, I can go first. I think, as I said in my opening statement, the new governance framework does feel like a different way of working. I feel, and I don't want to speak for Dany, but I know she feels that actually our roles have changed much more than we could have imagined when we discussed what we thought the new governance arrangements would be and how it would work. What I think internally some people felt was that it would basically remove some of the sort of decision-making processes. It has obviously removed all the committees that we had under LFEPA, but what we have made sure we've done is that we've got a very clear and formal way of making decisions and of monitoring those decisions and making sure that they're scrutinised and challenged both by senior staff and the Commissioner, but then by myself at the Deputy Mayor's Fire and Resilience Board, and actually we've got our next meeting this afternoon. So, and it's been a process. So I think it has gone well. I think retrospectively, if we'd anticipated exactly what our roles were going to be, we might have sort of put some things in place a bit more at the beginning, but we're getting there. I think that some of the comments made by Assemblymember Dismore about the comments from firefighters about the Commissioner have translated into much more positive industrial relations. So I think that where unions have raised issues about some of the decision making not having access in the same way that they had to LFEPA committees, that relationship of trust, both the Commissioners and I would hope with myself as well, has meant that we've been able to iron out issues as we've gone along in a consultative, collaborative way, rather than people feeling that the lack of the access through the formal processes through LFEPA going meant that they didn't have access, if that makes sense. I think that I meet regularly with the Commissioner and the deputies and Sue Budden as director to receive regular updates outside that formal meeting process. And actually quite a lot of the larger decisions that are made by the Commissioner and the team don't just have to be signed off by me, they have to be signed off here by the Corporate Investment Board. And that is challenge there. And I think that the staff involved in sort of managing that process with the Corporate Investment Board here have said that they actually get a lot of questions back about some of the decisions they're asking for sign-off. So you don't just get a tick box. But it is different. It's something that the Brigade is reviewing to make sure that we've got the right approach to the new governance arrangements. And I think that review's due to complete in the new year, led by Stephen Adams, who I think you probably know. And he'll be looking at how we've performed under the new governance arrangements and actually what we need to tweak further to make sure that we have those robust decision-making processes, that we have challenge both internally and that we engage effectively with the committee and with Assembly members here to make sure that the removal of the fire authority doesn't lead to less effective scrutiny.
Thank you. Dany.
Yes, equally from my point of view, it's been very different and far more different than I anticipated it would be. I think for me, one of the things that I was very concerned about is ensuring that the levels of scrutiny and rigour through every decision-making process haven't lost any ability by the fact I'm not being sort of externally challenged by the previous Resources Committee, for instance, you know, where you get that absolute challenge backwards and forwards. And I feel that's something I was very concerned about for myself, being the person who was ultimately signing decisions, to make sure I have that. So we've done a large internal restructure. And the way we work, the Directorate Management Boards are far more robust processes now as decisions come up. The way that they're challenged and scrutinised at that level, the pushback before they come into the Commissioners Board for consideration, the challenge that I provide to officers presenting papers to me at those boards are also very challenging around issues around publication and not losing any of the transparency that we had previously. And in fact, I've pushed back on several times and people said, do we really need to keep doing this? Yes, we absolutely do. My undertaking and my promise was that there would be no less information published or shared with people to allow people to be able to scrutinise the work we do. And I think that's been a very important part for me. As Fiona said, we're undertaking the 6-month review that we said we would do to look to see how we're getting on. That's taking place at the moment, and we've also had my internal audit team have a look at the governance process as well. I've asked them very early on to look at those and to report back to me on how they feel that we are progressing, because it is very important that I have somebody else come in and do those checks and balances to ensure the processes are right. For people who thought it was going to be easier and going to be a more simplified process, I don't really think it is. I think it has provided as much challenge as, or more so than we thought it would be. But we're learning all the time. It was never something, I said originally, a lot of it was something that has been discovered as we've gone along. But I'm very pleased with the way it's progressing so far.
Okay, good. And I'm glad to hear about the transparency, because that was certainly a concern cross-party that we wouldn't hear. I mean, one of the things, given all the different committees, we used to pick up issues and realise if there was something going wrong. Now we only have the one committee, and I'm concerned that we might not be able to pick things up, because you can't always ask questions about what you don't know what's going on. So if there's a real issue, how will that be brought to our attention as opposed to being dealt with internally and we won't have any view of it?
I'd like to think that we would come to, obviously your chair at the moment, to you as chair, and flag a major issue if it was of such concern that we felt it was something that the Assembly should know about in the same way that the committees would have known about in the past. And I think that we just need to sort of keep that dialogue open. We need to make sure that we do go into depth in all the details in the committees, obviously the sort of public forum, but that we also flag issues of concern and that make sure that you get the opportunity to meet senior staff on a one-to-one basis as well, to talk through what they're working on and sort of give you that insight that you might have got through committee papers, but that probably doesn't present through the quarterly reports that we've been sending the committee. So I think I've actually, following our discussion earlier this week, I've sort of suggested to the Commissioner that we set up a meeting for yourself as Chair to go in and talk to senior staff and the Assistant Commissioners, just so that you get that opportunity to talk to them at some point in the new year when your diary permits.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you mentioned the unions, Fiona. I know the unions are concerned. They're unclear as to when the meetings are, although I pointed out that it's all published and they could come. In the days gone by, they used to be able to come and address the committees, etc. And I think they're concerned that they can't do that anymore. I mean, is there any way we could all look at how we could address that?
I think, I mean, this is something that we've had, and it's been helpful to have good relations with the unions when we've been discussing how to address this. And I think it was a theme that came through quite a lot of the unions. I have regular meetings with the unions in line with how the Mayor meets the TfL unions. We've also set up meetings for them to meet the Mayor. It's something that came up at that. What we've agreed is that actually the trade unions will be given the agenda and the papers for the meetings I have with the Commissioner and the senior staff, we've had some issues over the timing of those because of trying to get everything bedded down and sort of work pressures. But we're getting into a system whereby we can give them enough notice of that they can come along and speak. And actually, the FBU is coming to talk about budget pressures at the meeting we're having this afternoon. So I hope we can resolve some of those concerns. It has been helpful that we've done it from a position that we have good relations with the trade unions, because obviously if people had any suspicion that it was intentional somehow, which obviously it isn't, I think it could have caused problems. So I think if we were to look back and say what could we have done better from the outset, it would have been to formalise that bit a bit sooner. But we're getting there now, and hopefully when we come into the new year and we've had the review of how things have gone, we'll make sure that that's much more streamlined, and that the representative bodies get access to information and the opportunity to talk to the issues that we're discussing and making decisions on in a proper and structured way.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Under the Police and Crime Act, London Fire Brigade has the duty to collaborate across the blue light services. So can you give me some examples of how you're actually doing that? I think that's probably Dany.
Yes, so I meet regularly with the Met Police Commissioner and the Head of London Ambulance Service at a very strategic level to discuss blue light partnership and collaboration. There's a blue light collaboration team that London Fire Brigade host that has representatives from both blue light parties that works out of London Fire Brigade headquarters. We regularly have meetings to discuss where there are opportunities, not just in the obvious opportunity of things like sharing property or procurement opportunities, but the wider blue light partnership of how we can work together. We have been working very closely with the police on the funding they secured around control rooms, and then looking at opportunities of how that could be used, how we could have some sense of having a central sort of point where there's some sort of major emergency where the blue lights are hosted together, so that we should ensure we're sharing information in a timely fashion. We've all been very clear that it's not just about financial savings, it's about efficiency of our work together and about development together for the future. Obviously we want to make sure that what we are doing has a purpose and meaning to it. And for me, the collaboration piece is also about collaboration with other fire and rescue services. So I'm very pleased to say the PPE we procured was part of the national procurement process. The fire escape hoods we did in partnership with Kent Fire and Rescue Service. And the electric fire engine that has recently come into the country, hosted by Rosenbauer, Surrey Fire and Rescue Service had it. They invited us to come down and have a look at it with them. And it's also for me about the partnership working with other members of the GLA and about how we can look at whether there's opportunities to share, to learn, to work together. So for me, the collaboration piece is very widespread across all different sectors, but for the right reasons, and ensuring that it really does not only deliver value for money, but a better service for people of London.
Okay, I mean the London Safety Plan also speaks about sharing infrastructure. You've just touched on that, but can you tell us more about where we're looking to share infrastructure?
Yeah, so we're looking not only at sort of high level projects. So if we're looking at any redesign of any premises or any opportunities, our headquarters is a classic example of that. We have another 5 sets of residents in our headquarters sharing the property space with us there. But it's also about local community initiatives. So at Stratford we have a London Ambulance Service first response bike team in there. We've worked with Safer Neighbourhood Partnership communities as well. So for me, it is about right the range from local borough commanders taking the opportunity to work in partnership with other agencies in their borough, to the national to the wider piece about how we can share estates, and if we are looking to redevelop any estate where there is opportunity to go into partnership. We have sites already where we share LAS and London Fire Brigade share one site together. The benefits from those that we realise, especially around training opportunities, around knowledge of each other's work, are immense. When I talk to my teams that have been doing work around responding to changing protocols for dealing with people who've been involved in road traffic collisions, for instance, there's the London Ambulance Service changed some of their protocols around the speed with which they like people extricated. It hadn't been shared as widely as possible. Where they've had the partnership working, it means that fire crews understand what the London Ambulance Service want and can work in partnership together quickly without people saying, oh, something changed. And I think some of those partnerships we've built on have come to great realisation recently around the acid attacks that we've been dealing with and the work we've been doing with Stagecoach and with various other companies where we as London Fire Brigade have been training people in how to respond and how to deal with people who've been victims of acid attacks. And that's gone across a wide-ranging reach. It started off as a local initiative in East London from a fire station that had attended several acid attacks. They proactively wanted to be able to help other people in their community to understand what to do. It's now become an initiative that's being launched across London. And I'm really proud of homegrown initiatives like that are local firefighters seeing risk and seeing how they can address it.
Yes, I mean, I'm a massive supporter of all these initiatives, and Stratford proves how well it works. We've been talking about this for a long, long while because it does make sense for more and more of our blue light services to work together. Is there any strategy going forward for a timeline where we will be looking at getting more safer neighbourhood teams into our buildings? Because there is the room in some of the fire stations. So if we specifically look at fire stations, have you got any pushback from anybody that it shouldn't happen, or have you got a timeline that you're looking to having more co-hosting the police, for example?
So we've got the timeline we work on is constantly working in partnership about how we can use spaces. Obviously, as part of our opening up fire stations, we are looking at the spaces available to be used not only by the police but by other community partners, which is a very important resource for us to be able to attract different areas of the community onto the fire station so that we then have those contact with them. You know, where if there are concerns raised, then, you know, our approach is to be able to have conversations with people, to be able to deal with issues, to have grown-up conversations about what we want to work in partnership with and what the end goal is and what we want to achieve. You know, and what we want to try and dispel is where people have, you know, issues and do some myth busting around we're all trying to join up and become one blue light service, we're all going to be doing each other's jobs. And I know there have been speculation around that because in different parts of the country they do have community responders that do all three blue light services. That's not the aim for London. The aim of London is about us working in partnership to ensure the safety of the people in our communities and especially identifying vulnerable people. And we can only do that if we work together and share information.
Yes, I agree. So you've got no pushback from anybody about different blue light services coming into, for instance, our stations?
There have been concerns raised by some of the unions about whether or not if we are seen to be working in close partnership with other blue light services, that we might not be viewed as being safe people by members of other communities, that people might, you know, potentially might see that we are not trusted partners anymore. But where we're talking about having community, you know, safer neighbourhood community teams, that is about us working in partnership together to work to identify those vulnerable people. And when we're having those conversations, explaining the work we're trying to do, then people understand that.
Of course. I mean, do you have issues regarding having police officers in the fire stations? Do you share those views of the unions?
What I want to make sure is that we don't lose any of the current faith and trust that the community of London have in London Fire Brigade. And we know that they place great trust in us. We know that when we knock on front doors to visit people, to do community safety visits, to impart our fire safety information, that people welcome us going into their houses. I don't want to do anything that would damage that trust, that would not allow us to access vulnerable people, because we are predominantly the main people who can make that access and make those risk assessment of people. So I think that, you know, if we work in partnership, if we explain what we're doing, it is for me about communication, and it's about talking about reasons why. This isn't about us, you know, hosting teams of arms officers or something like that on our fire stations. This is about neighbourhood engagement and keeping people safe in the communities.
Yes, no, I was mainly talking about safe neighbourhood teams. Okay, we'll watch that obviously as the time goes by. Thank you. So if I can talk to you about equipment now, what is the latest position on the mobilisation system provided by Capita?
So I'm pleased to say that, thank you very much. I welcome the fact that you took the time yesterday to visit the control centre at Merton. It was very well received, and the offer, genuine as ever, is always out there. If anyone wants to visit any of the fire stations, our mobilising centre, or anywhere else, we really genuinely welcome visits by Assembly members. Not only does it give a wider understanding of the work that you do and they do, but actually people like the fact people have taken the time to be interested in their job, so thank you for that. As you'll know from your visit yesterday, there are still some issues around, some very specific around font size. which some people are concerned of. There's a new upload which we're hoping will come in March, which will resolve that issue. But Vision continues to improve attendance times and improve mobilisation and is working well.
Yes, I will congratulate you on some of the attendance times. They're looking good. So what timescale for finally resolving, or do you think by March we'll...
So the new upload, obviously with any computer-based system, there will be modifications and developments that will keep going on. We have a very close relationship. There is a board that sits to discuss and resolve issues, which Tom George sits on and meets closely with partners from Capita, so that if there are issues, we can escalate them very quickly and ensure they are dealt with. It's something that will be subject to ongoing review, as any process would be, and ongoing developments as new sort of products come on the market, as it were.
Okay. I mean, how much have all these improvements cost the Brigade?
So they're part of the package we bought when we bought Vision. So, you know, they are subject to the costs. So I haven't got the detail of that with me. We can provide that.
One day we'll stop talking about Capita.
I hope so.
Yes, one day in the far distant future, no doubt. Have you altered the way you procure systems of this scale as a result of the numerous problems we've had with this system?
I think the problem is with something that's as niche as a mobilising system and that isn't as, you know, it's not an off-the-shelf product, it's not something that's used widely by other organisations. Obviously, Blue Light Partners do use systems. I think the problem is for something like that, that sometimes it can work in a smaller fire and rescue and or police service, but the scale of London and the volume of calls and the variety of different incidents we attend compared to also the variety of different structures in London means that it's always going to be a challenge. However, we are already looking at how we would procure the next system. We are planning it well in advance for the next replacement, and we will constantly look at developments on the market to see what the best product is. But it's a learning process, and it's always going to be very difficult.
Okay. Staying with procurement, if I may, the new uniforms. I do understand why they're gold, and I was one of the ones that was commenting on the colour of the things. But if we're looking at the equipment, which the staff seem to like, I was at Wembley Fire Station recently and discovered that the gloves are very, very slippery when they're used. Now, clearly, for a firefighter, that is a nightmare. Can you tell me what's happening with that?
Yeah, so because they're very new, as with any new leather glove you buy, they are, the first time you use them, the first couple of times they are slippery. We have given advice to firefighters and recommendations on how to wear them and wash them to start off with to remove that slippery factor. So it's purely a product of them being a very new product and the first couple of times of usage. They have had the advice on how to wash them, so how to remove that initial slippery barrier. They are fundamentally being very well received. The uniform, I hear the feedback that people do like it. It makes our firefighters much safer, not only in the fact that they can identify contaminants, which is a very serious issue for me, because previously the dark blue meant that it wasn't obvious when it was dirty, and therefore firefighters were walking around in contaminated gear, but also the fact it is more ergonomic, firefighters can move far more easily in it, the heat transfer and all those testing we've done, it means that firefighters are much safer, and I'm very pleased with the new equipment.
Good. Talking about cleaning them, that was something that came up at Wembley, and I know you visited Wembley, Fiona. There were some complaints about them having to clean their own uniform. Can you comment on that?
I think the issue, as I remember it from Wembley, because it did come up, I raised with Tom George, and I'm going to sort of explore a bit further as well, was about having proper facilities to clean. I think they didn't feel that there was appropriate space to clean their kit, sort of separate from where they. I can talk to you about it. I did talk to Tom, but I think it was something that they were clearly concerned about and felt could be relatively easily addressed. I think they suggested sort of sinks outside. So I did feed that in, and I will pursue it a bit more, but I think that it's one of those things that you don't necessarily pick up unless you go to a station, and you can see from the Commissioner's face that it's not something she was aware of, but it is something they raised with me when I went, and it clearly was an issue of concern, because there's no use people being able to see that their kit is dirty if they can't actually clean it in an appropriate way. So I'm sure it can be relatively easily addressed.
But the actual PPE itself is subject to a managed programme, so
Yeah.
that when it's contaminated, it does go away to manufacturers to be cleaned and washed and returned. So they have special bags to put the PPE in, and it then goes away for specialist cleaning. There is then a second set for them at the station to use. So heavily contaminated kit always goes away for external cleaning to ensure that the contaminants are thoroughly removed.
Well, may I ask you to look into that,
Of
because
course.
it was something that was brought up
Yeah, no, it was
separately
brought up as well.
with Fiona and I, and the comment was, I mean, the joy is that you can see where they're contaminated,
Yeah.
as you
Yeah.
said, whereas with the dark uniform that looked much nicer, but you couldn't see it was contaminated. And they said they had to clean their own uniforms, but if they were contaminated, there was nowhere to clean the contaminations off. And,
I think
and
it was the basic cleaning rather than the deeply
so
contaminated.
if I can ask you
Absolutely,
to
of
take
course.
that back and,
Yeah.
and get back and get back to firefighters, because clearly
Yeah.
it's something that's concerning them. I mean, earlier you mentioned an additional females joining, which is good news to us all. Are you improving the women's accommodation on station? Because when I did my tour of all the stations, the female accommodation in many was absolutely woeful. It was underneath stairs, it was shoved in the corner, etc. Because if we're to encourage females to join, then they must have something that's more or less on equivalent to the male changing rooms, etc.
Absolutely, 100% agree with that. You know, if we want to encourage people to come into our workplaces, then it's only fair that we give them somewhere that's fit for them to work, change and, you know, rest in. So as part of our buildings programme, we are looking at addressing that. In some places it's obviously far more difficult, where we've got very old style buildings that modifications are difficult and or very expensive. But we look at ways in which we can, you know, transform accommodation, whether that's by having, you know, separate places that can be either used as male or female independently and separately. Obviously we want to maintain the situation where we have individual spaces for showering, washing and that sort of thing for people. But for me it is about making it accessible for all people to come and work in the London Fire Brigade, and that is looking to the future as well, not only about the issue of men and women, but the issue about transgender people in the London Fire Brigade. And that is something that we need to plan for the future, because for me it is about recognising that there are different people in our communities, and we don't want somebody to come into our fire stations. Equally, for members of the public who are visiting our fire stations, if we want to open the doors to them, they need to be accessible and places that people can come and visit in and use facilities. So it's an ongoing programme of work for me, but obviously the women's facilities is something dear to my heart, having started at fire stations where they didn't exist at all in any way, shape or form. You know, where we've got to now is progress, but nowhere near enough.
Okay, thank you. And finally, can you talk to me about your youth programme? I was very, very involved in this for a long while. First of all, the cadets, I believe they're increasing, which is exceptionally good news. And can you talk to me about that? Can you also, or us, beg your pardon, can you also refer back to the LIFE programme? The LIFE programme, in my view, is excellent, but they seem to drop off a cliff when they finish that week. So how are we integrating all of that work into the cadets? Because if not, we have to look at the costing of the LIFE programme, because it is extremely expensive.
Yeah, and I share your views, and I welcome the support of all Assembly members' involvement in our youth engagement programmes. As I've made very clear, you know, not only are youth engagement programmes the key to me to recruiting people for the future, but they're also an instrumental part in making our communities safer. I know from the experience I had recently where I went to a pass-out parade for one of our cadet courses, that a number of the parents and carers of the young people there told me that they were convinced that had the young people not become involved in cadets, they would have become involved in gang crime instead in the areas they were living in. So for me it is a really important intervention where we can help support the mayors and the police initiatives around knife crime and around gang crime. And I welcome the increase. I genuinely want to have a cadet unit in every borough, and where we've got high risk areas. I was in conversation recently with some community groups in Tower Hamlets where we have cadets, but it's oversubscribed, and I would like to be able to increase the number of cadet units we have. I'm very pleased we now have a marine unit, we have a green unit, and we have a youth cadet unit as well. So for me, the reach of it and the potential for it is huge. It is around funding, and it is around getting dependable funding for us to be able to continue with it. You are right that some of our youth schemes are far more expensive, and how we translate those across and ensure we get the best value for those is something that I want to focus on, as is how we make sure that we keep contact with people who have been cadets and then get involved as young people, and how we can actually encourage them to work for the London Fire Brigade, not only as firefighters, whether it's in fire safety, whether it's in control, or whether it's in any of our other functions. So the whole area of how we manage that youth engagement programme as one piece, not as separate pieces of work, because we do have a number of different strands, and it is for me about ensuring they are coordinated, they are tied together, and they are meaningful. And that is a piece of work that will be ongoing for me.
Well, good. I mean, the live programme was started because unfortunately firefighters were being attacked. Are firefighters still being attacked at work?
I would love to say we weren't, but we do have subject to it at certain times. Obviously, flashpoints around things like bonfire nights, where you know, firefighters are still subject to having missiles and or fireworks thrown at them is an issue. There are still certain areas of London where we do have problems with, you know, and sometimes it is still around that young people sort of gang culture. I'm pleased to say it is far less than it was. We do report them as obviously serious RIDDOR events every time they happen, because they are attacks on firefighters. But it is then about us being able to identify and work with people in that local community. It is very much about, if we understand what's happening there, how we can make those interventions, whether or not we can then, you know, target those groups of people for a life course, or to encourage them to join cadets, or to work with the local communities about how we can help the understanding of those young people about the importance of the fire service and about the dangers of attacking us and or making hoax calls and or fire setting or any of those other things.
Okay. Do you want to say anything again?
No, I think the cadet programme is clearly a way that we're hoping to bring a much more diverse cohort into the brigade. It's something we've spoken about at the Fire Authority. It's also come up at the Fire Committee. And I think that for me, getting a cadet group in at least one in every borough would mean that that gave young people from across London an equal chance to get those opportunities, because otherwise it depends on whether you've got a strong cadet group in your borough, because it's quite unlikely that a young person would go to 2 or 3 boroughs away to join. And it's just so important for us. And when you speak to the cadets, I mean, obviously we're always pleased when they say they want to be firefighters, but so many of them go on to apply for other emergency services. And as young Londoners who often don't have the easiest start in life, you can see how the programme transforms their lives and their opportunities. And it isn't just an add-on for the brigade to do, it's actually sort of bringing people through into the brigade from our community. So I think the work that the Commissioner and the previous Commissioner has done, and the sort of team, the youth engagement team at the brigade is doing on an ongoing basis is truly impressive. And I hope that those of you who haven't been along to a cadet group take the opportunity to do so.
Okay, well, it's good to hear we're doing something that to have firefighters and police officers attacked is absolutely disgraceful, and anything we can do to stop it is good. Thank you
very much. Well, thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Deputy Mayor, for your answers. Can we now please move to the motion on the agenda set out in my name, namely that the Assembly notes the answers to the questions asked. Thank you very much. Item 5, can I draw your attention please to the revised statutory officer protocol set out on pages 11 to 22. Will you agree this please? Thank you. Now we come to petitions. We have a petition from Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you, Chair. I have a petition promoted by Wilston Green Access Group with 826 signatures. The prayer states, Dear Mr. Mayor, with the undersigned residents, traders, businesses and stakeholders urge you to make Wilston Green Station step-free as a matter of priority. Please find the signed petition by the users of Wilston Green Station. The station has 30 steps and is a prime candidate and meets your criteria for lifts at the station. It goes on in much detail, which makes a strong case for step-free access at the station. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Will you agree to accept that for passing forward? Thank you very much. We now have a petition from Assemblymember Devonish.
Very much. This petition is for the undersigned calling upon the Mayor and TfL to save the 19 bus between Holborn and Battersea Bridge and maintain and protect the full route of the number 19 bus route. I'd like to thank both Councillor Kim Caddy and Melanie Hampton for the work they've done with the community. All I would say is please TfL, listen. Buses are the most important issue for many Londoners. We deal with many issues in this Assembly, but buses are so important, particularly for the elderly and the disabled. And the way that TfL have consulted on the bus changes has not been acceptable.
Devonish, none of this is on the prayer. Will you agree that that is submitted? Thank you so much.
Agreed.
We now go to motions, and we have a motion in the name of Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you, Chair. At the UN Climate Change Conference in Katowice in Poland this week, Sir David Attenborough said, "Right now, we are facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change." He went on, "If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon." That's David Attenborough. The message is clear. Time is running out. It's already a matter of life or death for many people in countries across the world right now. It's not just isolated, drowning islands in faraway oceans, but whole towns like Paradise in California, where recently at least 85 people died, many burned in their cars, fleeing the wildfires that destroyed their whole town. And we're at a critical point. Average global temperatures have increased by 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. That's as a direct result of our use of fossil fuels and our carbon emissions. This degree of warming is seeing worrying rates of Arctic sea ice shrinkage, accelerated sea level rises, and more frequent extreme weather events. We probably all remember the frightening hurricanes that swept across the Caribbean last year, where thousands of people died and thousands more people lost everything. Not just one hurricane, but almost a whole alphabet of them. Hurricanes Arlene, Brett, Cindy, Don, Emily, Franklin, Gert, Irma, Jose, Katia, Lee, Maria, Nate, Ophelia, Philippe, Rena. It's been estimated that Hurricane Maria alone killed 4,645 people during the storm and its aftermath. And this year, the extensive wildfires in California and Greece and the forest fires that raged as far as inside the Arctic circles as this summer turned abnormally wide areas into a tinderbox. And we heard just now from the Fire Commissioner about the way that the London Fire Brigade has had to deal with so many more grass fires here in London, and how much resource of the brigade has been taken up with that, and also helping colleagues deal with peat fires elsewhere in the UK. The trend is very clear. Climate change is happening, and as politicians, we owe it to our communities to act. And how many more warnings do we ignore? Do we wait until London has been hit by a devastating extreme weather event that might cost billions, lose lives, and take years to recover from? Assemblymember Twycross is quite rightly including climate change in the risks identified in her Resilience Forum work. Perfect timing. We may have only 12 years before we potentially lose control. The recent study from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, with their recent report, showed that at the current rate of warming, average global temperatures could exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius as early as 2030. That's just 12 years away. And the 1.5 degree temperature is like a guardrail between what the global scientific consensus believes we have a chance to cope with, and on the other hand, unimaginable and irreversible social, environmental, and economic devastation. And keeping to 1.5 degrees warming is going to be hard, but it is possible. Although that's only if we focus, collaborate with people across the world, and take these risks seriously. School children in Australia are on strike about climate change, and they're calling on politicians to act. Citizens in London and across the UK are calling for action to tackle the climate emergency. Now, the Mayor's 2050 zero carbon target is now beginning to look a little too little too late. It's not going to stop temperatures from overshooting the 1.5 degree threshold to 2, 3, or possibly even 4 degrees of warming. And that would leave us reliant on just unproven technologies like carbon capture to try and sort it out. So why am I urging you to support this motion? Because the responsibility lies with us. The actions that we take today and in the next few years will affect all aspects of our lives, our children's lives, and those of all future generations. On the 14th of November, the City of Bristol declared a climate emergency, with the Council unanimously backing a motion by Councillor Carla Denyer with a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030 in an effort to avoid irreversible climate breakdown. This is the scale of ambition that we need if we're going to safeguard Londoners and all our futures. And that is why I'm proposing that the Mayor declares a climate emergency, sets out the actions needed to make London carbon neutral by 2030, and that he calls on the government to give him the powers to make this possible. Okay. And by example, setting a precedent for other UK and world cities to follow. I move the motion.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Berry.
I formally second and reserve one.
I think we have an amendment tabled. Assembly Member Cooper to move the amendment.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And that was an interesting contribution from Assembly Member Russell. The motion was carried unanimously in Bristol, but that may be because it didn't contain an attack on Marvin Rees, the Labour Mayor of Bristol, and all of the Labour members in Bristol felt quite happy to carry the motion. So I find it extremely disappointing that you've drafted something that contains what I consider to be an entirely gratuitous attack on the Mayor of London. On the 26th of November, Michael Gove was talking about climate change and climate emergency and the urgency of the need to acknowledge that weather patterns are changing in the world. On the 27th of November, every single British paper was talking about extreme weather. And we know it's not just grass fires and heat and really hot summers. We also know it's bursts of intense rainfall, which we're unable to capture, and that creates drought likelihood. But we also see warmer winters and more likelihood of flooding as well. So we know that the temperature and weather and climate is changing. We know that there is a big issue which has been acknowledged by members of the Conservative Party, members of the Labour Party, and members, of course, of the Green Party. So why you find it necessary to draft something that, you know, the Mayor has done an awful lot. He has already moved forward implementing the T-charge. We've brought forward the introduction of the ultra-low emission zone. He's also joined the fight against the launch of Heathrow's third runway. And so to include an attack on the Mayor in this motion seems entirely gratuitous. But worse than that, worse than making gratuitous attacks on the Mayor, I also find it quite difficult to be lectured by Caroline about the need for addressing a climate emergency when the Greens have actually refused to serve on the Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Now, you know, if you really took these issues seriously and you really were concerned about the impact of climate and weather on this great city of ours, you would actually be serving on that committee and picking up these issues under the leadership of Assembly Member Hall and Assembly Member Dismore, who are doing great work with taking these issues forward and making sure that this committee, working together with the Deputy Mayor for Fire, is able to address the concerns that you are just talking about. What I can't stand, and I believe there may be others in this chamber who feel the same way, is what I would characterise as virtue signalling. And it seems to me that not serving on a committee that is actually addressing the practical realities of what we're calling a climate emergency, but just coming here to talk about it in this chamber, consists of nothing but virtue signalling. So we've amended this motion. We've taken out the attacks on the Mayor, who we do think is stepping up, and other mayors around the country have come to work with him in terms of the work that he's doing on clean air. And we've also said that declaring a climate emergency is one thing, but it must be supported by specific emergency plans and that he needs the powers and, of course, the funding, and that includes for the fire brigade being able to address these issues properly in terms of funding for flooding as well as for fire. And I hope you will all support this amendment. Thank you.
Formally second and reserve my right to speak, but I'm not sure if it's required at this moment in time.
Are you proposing to accept this amendment?
I certainly am, yes.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody want to speak, or should we go straight to the summation? Or speeches from the seconders if they wish to speak? Okay, so we will take a summing up speech on the motion as amended. And that is...
Thank you very much. I am very happy to accept this amendment from the Labour group, which makes two changes to the motion. It very sensibly asks the, actually it makes three, asks the mayor to ask the government for the funding to make this climate emergency action possible. That is, of course, a really helpful addition, and I accept that with great gratitude. I'm sorry that Assemblymember Cooper thinks that that this was an unnecessary attack on the mayor. I was making the point that having a plan that works to 2050 now, in the light of the IPCC report that has changed the whole context the mayor is working in, makes the plans for 2050 not look ambitious enough. I did not intend to attack the mayor on his excellent work addressing climate change and environmental issues. However, the other thing that the amendment does is to support specific emergency plans. I just ask them to be drawn up, but if they need to be specific, I'm very, very happy to accept that amendment. Politicians are doing pretty badly on all of this. Protesters are demonstrating. They can't believe we're just so left behind. They don't want to hug a husky. They're just exasperated that we are not taking these risks seriously. So I hope very much that members will support this motion.
Thank you. Those in favour of the motion as amended, please show. 1,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, Chairman.
Those against, please show.
None against, Chairman.
Okay, do I have to call for abstention? Okay, well, the motion is carried. We now go to motion in the name of Assemblymember Berry.
Thank you, Chair. So, yeah, I'd like to propose the motion on sexual health services, and I'm very pleased that this is being seconded by Assemblymember Copley from the Labour group. Last week, we marked World AIDS Day, and we remembered the profound and tragic impact this pandemic had on London, the hardest hit city in the UK. And while public policy, and in particular health professionals in London, have had incredible success in bringing HIV infection rates right down, there's still a lot of unsafe sex going on in London, judging by the significant rise in other sexually transmitted infections, and there's a huge need for public health work and prevention as well as treatment. Nationally, rates of syphilis and gonorrhea have increased by 16% and 23% respectively, and London accounts for almost half of the cases reported in England. And despite this backdrop of record demand for services, I investigated council funding recently and found that in total, sexual health service funding from London boroughs has dropped from a total of 176 million in 2013-14 after responsibility was transferred to councils to 148 million in 2017-18. This is a 16% reduction. This is money that is really needed to keep vital programmes going, from prevention education to treatment for a wide range of sexually transmitted infections, as well as contraception and specialist advice. For some people, even asking for help for sexual health problems can be a barrier to accessing services. But the situation is worsening as Londoners are having to compete for appointments or even being turned away in some cases from clinics who are struggling to meet demand. I very much commend the Assembly's Health Committee, who have also investigated and raised these issues with the Mayor and the Chair, my Assembly colleague, Dr Sahota. He's written to the Mayor to ask him to step in the clinics question. We recognise, as we say in our motion, that although the Mayor does not control where councils make cuts, he is able to exert his political influence, in particular through the London Health Board, to make the case to London councils for supporting sexual health services as a priority within health budgets. In addition, I've noted in my response to the Mayor's health inequality strategy that while this does have a focus on HIV prevention, it does not include measures to help support wider sexual health services and contraception. We think this is a gap, and that though the Mayor responded with concern to the Health Committee's letter, he should be taking a more active role in monitoring services and encouraging more funding and asking for more focus from councils and health providers on this. We can't afford to take our eye off public health and prevention on this issue and realise too late that we're making a mistake. The motion asks for the Mayor to use his influence to convince councils to make it a priority, to keep these vital services open and accessible for anyone who needs them, and I hope the whole Assembly today will vote for him to urge him to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Assembly Member Berry for tabling this important motion. I was delighted when the Mayor signed London up to the Fast Track Cities initiative, which aims to end new HIV infections by 2030 and to eliminate stigma. Not only has London exceeded the UN's 90-90-90 target, which is 90% of people living with HIV knowing their status, 90% of people with diagnosed HIV on treatment, and 90% of people on treatment with suppressed viral loads, London has also exceeded the UN's more challenging 95-95-95 target. But this is not a time for complacency, and London faces major challenges due to cuts to public health budgets. 6 long-established sexual health clinics in London have closed in the last few years. The Dean Street Clinic in Soho, which is a vital service for London's LGBT community, has been forced to cut appointments from 350 a day to 75. This is at the same time as rising demand for sexual health services across the whole country. Now, it's a good thing that more people are choosing to get tested, but it is a major problem if people are turning up only to be turned away. It also undermines the very important campaigns run by both the public sector and charities, such as particularly by the Terence Higgins Trust, who I visited recently, which are urging people to get tested. Now, this motion asks the Mayor to work with local authorities to prioritise sexual health funding. But we must also recognise the immense financial pressures that councils are under because of the disproportionate level of cuts they have been forced to endure since 2010. And in Lewisham, where of course I'm now a councillor, for example, the council has lost 60p in every pound of its budget since 2010. The government's decision to cut public health budgets by £600 million has been a huge mistake, and it's also a false economy. The Department for Health's own data shows that for every £1 spent on sexual health services and contraception, which saves £11 over the long term. We've seen a welcome fall in new HIV diagnoses in London recently, but cuts to sexual health services puts that progress at risk. Thanks to medical advances, people living with HIV now have the same life expectancy as people without HIV, but only if it is detected early enough, which means that we need to make it as easy as possible for people to test. Some other sexually transmitted diseases, such as syphilis, are on the rise, as well as drug-resistant strains of certain STDs. I also want to make an appeal to the government to make PrEP available fully on the NHS. For members who don't know, PrEP is a pill you can take every day, which is 99% effective at preventing HIV transmission. There is currently a limited trial underway, but it's also full. It's almost full, and not everyone who is most at risk of becoming HIV positive can get on it. The recent fall in new HIV diagnoses is almost certainly down in part to people buying the pills online, which you can do perfectly legally for up to 3 months' worth at a time. But not everyone can afford to buy it, and those who can't afford it and who can't get on the trial risk HIV infection, which is not only personally devastating, particularly because of the stigma that sadly still surrounds HIV, but also costs the NHS far more in the long term than providing preventative measures in the first place. Prevention is always better than cure, but in the case of HIV, where there still is no cure, prevention is better than a lifetime of treatment. Only by funding sexual health services properly can we ensure London meets its target of 0 new infections by 2030. I hope the whole Assembly will support this motion.
Assembly Member Wolf.
Mr. Mayor, I raised to support this motion. Assembly Member Bailey and I were the only Assembly members to attend an event on last Friday, the Fast Track Cities event hosted by the Terence Higgins Trust in the map room of City Hall. And we were, I was certainly impressed by the progress that had been made in terms of identifying those people who have contracted HIV, the treatment, and the work to make sure that the disease is untransmittable. So the progress is there. This is an example, I think, of where common sense overwhelmingly says that if we spend money up front, we save money later on. And it's overwhelmingly an example of why the silos of funding in local government and local care services are getting in the way of us making smart investments. Because clearly, if local authorities were to invest more in sexual health services, the health service themselves would save down the line. Assembly Member Copley referred to PrEP, and PrEP is a prime example. And you might have views about whether or not people should be getting up to that kind of thing. That is absolutely irrelevant. It's irrelevant in terms of the public health investment, because they're going to do it anyway. And if those practices take place anyway, it is the health service that you have to pay for. So take, for example, PrEP, which I believe at the outside estimate is £400 a year. The cost of an infected person with HIV is £10,000 a year in order to reduce the infectious rate. So this is just common sense. Strip away the morality. People do a lot of things that we don't approve of, but they're going to do them anyway. And we need to ensure that the resources are there to be able, for us as a city, to keep ourselves healthy. I look forward to the initiatives in London where we have a closer financial relationship between the health service and boroughs themselves, such as is going on in Barking and Dagenham at the moment, because I think that our dream is that investment in one area can be reaped in another, and that can be proceeds of that investment can be seen by the whole funding pot rather than just in these silos. So I don't normally support motions that say spend more money, but I actually think this isn't about spending more money, it's about investing the money that we are spending more wisely, and so I'm happy to support this motion.
Okay. Any more contributions? Those in favour of the motion, please. I'm sorry.
Thank you to everyone who's spoken. I won't add any more.
Are you saying that you're very happy
I'll
with
waive
what has
that,
been
thank
said? Okay, thank you so much. Those in favour, please show.
Those in favour of London.
Unanimous. Thank you very much. Can we now please move on to item 8? Will you please note the commitments made by the Mayor at meetings held between May 2016 and November 2018?
Agreed.
Will you note the date of the next meeting, which is at 10 o'clock on Thursday the 13th of December here? Thank you. There is no other urgent business.